Welcome to today's scary story session. These stories are not for the faint of heart, so be prepared to be scared out of your wits. If you enjoy being scared and want to hear more stories like these, be sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a scary story session. Let's get started. The sun had begun to set on our first day in the wilderness, casting the sky in an array of pinks, oranges, and purples. We had set up our tents in a small clearing near a dilapidated old cabin, and we were all feeling pretty good about ourselves. Our little group of friends had been planning this camping trip for months, and we had finally made it to our remote wilderness destination. As the night began to fall, we huddled around the campfire, roasting hot dogs and swapping stories. It was a perfect evening, peaceful, quiet, and exactly what we had all been hoping for. But as the night wore on, things began to change. Strange noises could be heard coming from the cabin, creaks, groans, and eerie howls that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. At first, we tried to ignore them, thinking they were just the sounds of an old, abandoned building settling into the earth. But as the noises grew louder and more frequent, we couldn't help but investigate. The inside of the cabin was just as dilapidated as the outside, with peeling wallpaper, cracked windows, and dust-covered furniture. But as we wandered around, something caught our eye. There, in the corner of the room, was an old journal. It was filled with the ramblings of a hermit who had lived in the cabin decades ago. We sat around the campfire, taking turns reading from the journal. The hermit had been driven mad by isolation, and his scribbles were filled with paranoid rants about imaginary creatures and sinister forces. We laughed at first, thinking that the hermit was just a crazy old man with a wild imagination. But as the night went on, things took a dark turn. The campfire kept going out for no reason, despite our best efforts to keep it burning. And the strange noises from the cabin grew louder and more frequent, until they seemed to be surrounding us on all sides. That's when we saw it, a figure looming in the darkness, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It was the hermit, his spirit enraged by our intrusion into his home. He was seeking revenge against anyone who disturbed his rest. We ran in terror, but it was no use. The hermit's ghost was relentless in its pursuit, and we soon realized that we were trapped in the wilderness with no way out. Days stretched on, and the hermit's spirit continued to haunt us. We were exhausted, hungry, and scared, but we had no choice but to keep running. I felt like we were in a never-ending nightmare, with no escape in sight. As the days wore on, we began to learn more about the hermit's past. He had been a recluse, living in the cabin for years without any contact with the outside world. And when he had died, his spirit had become trapped in the cabin, unable to move on to the afterlife. We knew that we had to find a way to put the hermit's spirit to rest, but we had no idea how to do it. We scoured the journal for clues, hoping to find something that would help us break the curse that had trapped the hermit's ghost. And then, one night, we found it. A small entry in the journal hinted at a hidden object that could be used to banish the ghost. We searched the cabin from top to bottom, and finally, we found it, an old, rusted knife hidden beneath the floorboards. With the knife in hand, we prepared for a final showdown with the hermit's ghost. We waited in the darkness, our hearts pounding in our chests as the hermit's ghost approached. The ghostly figure of the hermit loomed closer and closer, his glowing eyes illuminating the darkness. We stood our ground, holding the rusted knife tightly in our hands, unsure if it would be enough to defeat the spirit. As he drew near, the hermit's spirit let out an ear-piercing shriek, causing us all to wince in pain. But we didn't falter. We knew what we had to do. With a burst of adrenaline, we charged forward and plunged the knife into the heart of the ghost. A brilliant light filled the cabin, and we were momentarily blinded. When our vision returned, we saw that the hermit's ghost had vanished. We let out a collective sigh of relief, knowing that we had finally put the spirit to rest. But as we gathered our belongings and prepared to leave the wilderness, we couldn't help but feel uneasy. The events of the past few days had shaken us to our core, and we knew that we would never forget the terror we had experienced. Jack had been looking forward to this trip for months. He was an experienced hiker, and he loved nothing more than getting lost in the wilderness for a few days. He had convinced his friends, Sarah, Mark, and Rachel, to come along, promising them a trip they would never forget. But as the sun began to set on the first day of their journey, Jack started to feel uneasy. The trail they had been following had become less distinct, and the landmarks he had been using to navigate had disappeared. They had been hiking for hours, but it felt like they hadn't made any progress. Sarah, Mark, and Rachel were starting to get worried too. They had all agreed to put their faith in Jack's navigational skills, but now they were beginning to doubt him. "We should have brought a map," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "We don't need a map," Jack replied. "I know this area like the back of my hand. We'll find our way." But as the darkness grew deeper and the forest closed in around them, Jack's confidence began to wane. They set up camp in a small clearing, and he tried to reassure his friends that everything would be all right. But even he couldn't deny that something was off. The forest was too quiet, and the air was heavy with an oppressive stillness. As they sat around the campfire, they heard strange noises in the distance. It sounded like laughter, but not the kind of laughter that came from human voices. It was too guttural, too deep. Sarah's eyes widened in fear, and she clutched Mark's arm tightly. "What was that?" she asked. "I don't know," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But we should keep moving in the morning. Maybe we'll find our way out of this." But as they tried to settle down for the night, the sounds grew closer. They could hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the forest floor. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest, and he knew that something was out there, watching them. The first to go missing was Rachel. They woke up in the morning to find her sleeping bag empty, with no sign of a struggle. They called out her name, but there was no answer. Jack searched the area around the campsite, but there was no trace of her. He tried to stay calm, but the fear was starting to eat away at him. "We need to stick together," he told Sarah and Mark. "We can't let this thing pick us off one by one." They continued to hike, hoping to find their way back to civilization. But the forest seemed to be playing tricks on them. The trail would appear and disappear, and landmarks they had passed earlier would suddenly reappear. It was as if they were walking in circles, and Jack was starting to feel like they were never going to get out. And then Mark went missing. They had stopped for a rest, and when they looked up, he was gone. They called out his name, but there was no answer. They searched the area frantically, but there was no sign of him. Sarah was in tears, and Jack was starting to feel like they were all going to die out here. "We need to find a way out of here," he said, his voice shaking. "We can't stay here any longer." They pressed on, their nerves on edge. They could hear the laughter and whispers getting closer, and they knew that they were being watched. Sarah was clinging to Jack's arm, her eyes wide with fear. They had to keep moving, they had to find a way out. But then Sarah was gone too. They had stopped for a break, and when Jack turned around, he saw that the figure had disappeared. He rubbed his eyes, thinking that it might have been a trick of the light, but he knew deep down that it wasn't. He tried to call out to the others, but his voice caught in his throat. Fear had taken over him. Suddenly, he heard a rustling noise from the bushes. He turned towards it and saw something moving. It was coming towards him. Jack could feel his heart racing as he stood there frozen. The rustling grew louder and louder until a figure emerged from the bushes. It was Sarah, one of the hikers. Jack let out a sigh of relief. "Jack, are you okay?" Sarah asked, concern etched on her face. Jack nodded, still feeling uneasy. He told Sarah what he had seen, but she didn't believe him. She thought he was just imagining things. "We need to find the others and get out of here," Jack said, his voice shaking. Sarah agreed, and they set out to find the rest of the group. They called out to them, but there was no answer. As they walked further into the forest, they realized that they were completely lost. The trail had disappeared, and landmarks they passed earlier had vanished. Panic set in as they realized they were stranded in the middle of nowhere. As they walked, they heard strange noises coming from the darkness. It sounded like whispers and laughter. They couldn't see anyone or anything, but they knew they were being followed. The two of them tried to stay calm, but they could feel their nerves fraying. Sarah was visibly scared, and Jack knew he had to be strong for both of them. They walked for what felt like hours until they stumbled upon a small clearing. There was a strange feeling in the air, almost as if they were being watched. Suddenly, they heard a blood-curdling scream. It was coming from the woods. Sarah looked at Jack, her eyes wide with fear. They both knew they had to investigate. They slowly made their way towards the sound, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they got closer, they could hear the sounds of struggle. Jack knew that they were about to come face to face with whatever had been following them. They burst through the trees and found themselves in a small clearing. The rest of the group was there, huddled together in fear. One of the hikers, Tom, was lying on the ground, his throat ripped open. Everyone was in shock, not knowing what to do. They could hear something moving in the shadows. It was circling them, playing with them like a cat with a mouse. Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the darkness. It was the same one Jack had seen earlier. It was tall and thin, with glowing eyes and a twisted, malevolent grin on its face. It was like nothing they had ever seen before. The creature slowly advanced towards them, and the group realized that they were in grave danger. They knew they had to fight back, or they would end up like Tom. They picked up whatever they could find and attacked the creature. They hit it with branches, rocks, and anything else they could get their hands on. The creature fought back, but they managed to hold it off. Finally, the creature let out a blood-curdling scream and disappeared into the shadows. The group was left shaken and scared, but they had survived. As they made their way back to civilization, they were haunted by the memory of what had happened. They knew that they had encountered something otherworldly, something that defied explanation. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the stifling heat of the day as my family and I settled into our campsite in the deep woods. The sound of a nearby stream and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze set a calming tone as we sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories. It was a much-needed break from the hustle and bustle of our everyday lives, and I was excited to spend this time in nature with my family. But as we settled in for the night, a loud noise interrupted our peaceful surroundings. At first, I thought it was just an animal, but as the noise continued, my heart began to race. I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining my eyes in the darkness to try to make out what was causing the commotion. That's when I saw it. A tall, thin creature covered in matted fur with eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. My heart pounded in my chest as the creature began to move towards us, its long arms reaching out to grab us. My family and I ran in terror, but it was no use. The creature was relentless in its pursuit, and we soon realized that we were being stalked by a Wendigo, a legendary creature from Native American folklore that was said to possess those who engaged in cannibalism. The days stretched on, and the Wendigo continued to hunt us. We were exhausted, hungry, and scared, but we had no choice but to keep running. I felt like we were in a never-ending nightmare, with no escape in sight. Just when it seemed like all was lost, we stumbled upon a small cabin deep in the woods. It was old and run down, but it offered us a chance to rest and gather our strength. But our respite was short-lived. We soon began to hear strange noises in the night, footsteps outside, scratching at the door. We knew the Wendigo had found us again, and it was only a matter of time before it attacked. We barricaded the doors and windows and armed ourselves with whatever weapons we could find. We waited, hearts pounding, as the Wendigo circled the cabin, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then, one night, it attacked. We fought back with everything we had, our fear driving us to a level of determination we never knew we had. It was a fierce battle, but in the end, we emerged victorious. The Wendigo retreated back into the woods, defeated. We were forever changed by our encounter with the Wendigo. The horror of it all still haunts me to this day, but I also know that it taught me a valuable lesson. I learned about the power of fear and the strength that lies within us all. We emerged from that ordeal stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever before. As we made our way back to civilization, I knew that my family and I would never forget the terror we had experienced in the deep woods. But we also knew that we had faced it head-on and come out on top. We had learned that we were capable of overcoming even the most frightening of obstacles. And for that, I am forever grateful.